All right. So hello, I'm Ashwathy. I'm a machine learning research engineer at Embark, and I want to talk to you today about creative support for game writing, specifically looking at how we can use large language models to complement human creativity rather than try to mimic or replace it. First, a small introduction to Embark Studios, where I work. Embark Studios is a game studio based in Stockholm. It was founded in 2018 with the mission to use new technologies to innovate and empower creators. We have two publicly announced games. First one is already launched. The Finals is a free-to-play first-person shooter. The unique thing about this game is there are destructible environments, which leads to some very dynamic, fast-paced gameplay. We have another game that's really close to launch. It's called Arc Raiders. This is a third-person extraction shooter game. It's a PvP, PvE game where you play as a raider who's trying to extract valuable loot and fight mechanized threats known as Arc. So I work in the machine learning team at Embark, and in the past year, I've been working with the narrative team to try and figure out how we might be able to use AI-based tools to help with narrative design and writing. So large language models have come a long way in the past few years, and there's many different ways to use them. There are many AI writing assistant tools out there. People tend to use it for things like help with brainstorming or background research or world building. But we wanted to look beyond that a little bit and try and figure out how we might be able to use it to help solve some of the fundamental problems when it comes to games writing. There are some risks and concerns when it comes to using generative AI to produce content that could go into the game. A lot of these models are trained on large amounts of data, some of which might be copyrighted or used without creator consent. And I'm not going to get into this a lot in this talk, but it's an ongoing discussion and debate, the ethics and transparency behind these training practices. There's also the risk that the models might produce biased or unsafe content. So even though this is getting better with better and better aligned models, we still want to have that control and final say over what gets into the game. Another important thing is that creative writing is inherently enjoyable and meaningful, and we don't want to automate away aspects of creation that are fun. Ideally, we would want to use AI for things that humans don't want to do or can't feasibly do, so that it actually opens up new possibilities. We want tools that give us more control over the thing that we're making and have more room to be ambitious. So all of the work that I'm going to talk to you about today is AI being used in the process of creation to support the writers rather than to produce the final content that goes in the game. And it's all exploratory work, so just to be clear, again, there's no AI-written text in the game so far. So what are the challenges when it comes to writing for games? When you write a book, what you write is essentially what your audience is going to read. But when you write for games, there are many computational systems sitting in between. It could be procedural elements that you have in the game, or it could just be some branching logic that you have based on game state, or maybe you have some AI NPCs that you can talk to. So the thing that you write gets transformed and filtered through these computational processes, and by the time it gets to the player, it can show up in many different game contexts. So you might write something with a certain tone in mind, but by the time it shows up in the game, it might show up in a context that you hadn't anticipated, and it can come off very differently than what you had originally intended. So this is one of the challenges when you write for games. You're not just writing stories, you're designing story spaces. And as a writer, it can be hard to keep track of things like logic and context and continuity and emotional arcs along all the experiences that are possible in the story space. And the more responsive you want to make your world and the narrative, the harder it becomes for the author. So writers have to often constrain the complexity of the story space that they're making, and this can sometimes lead to the narrative feeling not that well integrated with gameplay. But what if we didn't have to keep track of all this ourselves? So the tools I'm going to talk to you about today are tools where we've used the language understanding capabilities and the common sense reasoning capabilities of the language models to surface problems in the story space, to use it analytically instead of generating content to fill up the story space. And we're using it to provide insight into how the narrative content that's being written by the writers will behave at scale in different game contexts. So these are the tools that we're using in this way. So first one is a readabout tool, which explores the story space and generates reviews of different possible experiences in the story space. And the second one is a log explorer tool, which interprets and summarizes game logs. So the general idea for the first tool is that you can simulate many playthroughs through the story space, and you can use an AI agent to do this, or if the architecture of the story space is something like simple branching logic, then you can use deterministic algorithms for this as well. And then you ask the LLM to read and review each individual simulated playthrough and surface any problems that it can find. So you can use this for any type of story space as long as you're able to write something to simulate playthroughs through it. For the demo, I'm going to use the example of quest chains because Arc Raiders has quest chains. But unfortunately, since the game is really close to launch, but it's not released yet, I can't show the actual quests or quest chains from the game. It's unfortunate because it's like literally 2-3 days before the embargo lifts, but I'm going to use some mock quests that I generated for an imaginary game for the purposes of the demo. So let's consider a quest like this one, where the writer has to write the high-level description of the quest and some voiceover scripts for what the character says when you meet the character for the first time, when you accept the quest, when you're ready to claim the rewards for the quest, and when you complete the quest. And many of these quests are strung together in quest chains to create a narrative experience for the player. So in the beginning, you have some side quests, and in the middle, you can see that it branches out. So there's 2 leads that the player can pursue from the theft quest, and they can pursue them in whatever order they want. But they have to complete both threads to unlock the quest called Spy. So this is a really simple mock demo that I made. Real quest chains in real games, and the ones we have in Arc Raiders are much more complex than this. But you can already see that this creates a few different states. For example, if you're writing a quest like Archives, in the middle, near the end over there, you already have a few different states that you have to keep track of. The player may or may not have completed these side quests in the beginning, and they may or may not have completed some of the quests in the parallel thread. So it's already quite a few different states that you have to keep in your mind. So this is an example of the tool being used to review that quest chain. It's just a really quick GIF. You can select the quest that you're interested in reviewing. And then when you click on Get Traversal, a random valid playthrough up till this quest is generated. So you would have completed some quests, you would have some quests that are available alongside this one, and you would have some quests that are accepted but not completed yet. And since there's a few different valid orders through the question that you can play and get to this point, each time you click on Get Traversal, you get a different configuration of these quests, all of which are valid. And then when you click on Explore Issues, it calls the language model that's prompted to pick out anything that it feels off about this particular traversal of the question in this order. So here is a screenshot of the feedback from the last slide so that it's easier to read. So here it says Emeron should not be aware of the emblem. That's so in the archives quest that we were evaluating, Emeron talks about an emblem. But here it says in the Silas apartment quest, Emeron is not explicitly informed about the emblem. So it does some reasoning and also thinks of some justification for why this could be. So here it says maybe Imran received this information off screen. And then taking all of this into consideration, it comes up with a severity rating for the issue as well. So here are the quests that was being talked about in the feedback. So archives is the quest that we were evaluating. So here you can see Imran is talking about the emblem as if he knows about it. In Scylla's apartment quest, however, we can see that it's only when the quest is completed that Imran is getting told about the emblem. But in the quest traversal that we evaluated earlier, Scylla's apartment quest was accepted but not completed yet, so Imran wasn't told about it yet. So this tool is really good at picking up common but subtle issues like this. It can be really hard to track what the characters know and not know, especially when the player is allowed to play through the quests in many different orders. It's also good at identifying things like sudden shifts in tone. For example, maybe you have two quests available simultaneously, where in one of them, the NPC is talking about something very urgently, like they're in crisis. But simultaneously, there's another quest that's available from the same NPC where they're talking about something really casually, or it's something really trivial. It's also good at picking out redundancies. So maybe you have some exposition that in some orders of the quest chain, it gets revealed exactly how you want it to. But in some other orders, maybe the exposition comes too late. And by that time, it feels redundant to keep talking about it again. It's also good at picking out contradictions. So maybe you have a quest where some NPC has died, but in some orders in which you can traverse the quest chain, maybe that NPC shows up later on after they've died. It's just generally good at picking when something feels off. So it could be an abrupt transition or something that's causing confusion for the player in some particular orders. And that's why it's useful to use large language models for this, because we can prompt it to pick anything that feels off, and it's able to work with fuzzy instructions like that. So the good thing about this is that we can get subjective feedback from a player perspective. And each time you click on Explore Issues, you get a different subjective feedback. It generates a new review, just as you'd get different reviews from different players. As writers and designers, we can sometimes be a bit too close to the content that we're writing because we know all of the game lore and we know all the quests. So even if we repeatedly read the quests in many different orders, it can be hard for us to keep track of what the player knows or what they don't know by a certain point. But the large language model can review each traversal with fresh eyes each time, and we can get it to review as many traversals as we want and generate as many reviews as we want. And we can even prompt it with different player personas. So maybe you want to generate some reviews as a player who is more interested in combat, and some other reviews as someone who is more interested in exploring the map or exploring the narrative. In the demo that I showed, we were evaluating one quest at a time, but you can also run the entire evaluation end-to-end in an automated way and run this for all the quests. So you can generate many traversals through the quest chain and generate many reviews of each of those traversals and then summarize the results. We can filter it out using the severity ratings, or we can average the severity ratings to point out where in the quest chain things are breaking down and why it might be. So you can think of a workflow like this one, where first you use the tool like in the demo that I showed, where you explore anything that feels off, so any issues that can come up. And then when you see some common recurring issues, you can write more targeted prompts to look out for those issues. So we have things like a prompt that looks for contradictions, logical errors in the quest traversal. And we have another one that looks for any transition that feels abrupt. And we have another one that looks for, is there anything that the player might be confused by? And then we can run a batch evaluation using these prompts for all the quests for many traversals and highlight where in the quest chain issues are getting picked up. And then the writer can review the feedback and decide if they want to revise the text or the structure, and then iterate until they're happy with the quest chain. So this helps us identify any missing narrative links between the quests that the writer might have overlooked. But it can also help us identify issues that only show up in the flow of the quests. So maybe you have two quests that don't look like they're related when you consider them next to each other, but there's some orders in which they work and some orders in which they don't work. Maybe, for example, you have quest A and quest B that don't contradict, but when quest C happens just before quest B, then quest B is a contradiction given A and C. So it's good at evaluating the quest chain in the context of all the other quests in many different orders. And this allows writers to iterate along large quest chains fast. Of course, this doesn't replace actual playtesting because a lot of this is simulated, but it lets them have some confidence if they want to refactor the quest chain or if they want to make some edits to an existing one, because we can do the integration testing automatically and catch any fallout. But ultimately, what it allows us to do is that it gives writers confidence to experiment with more complex story spaces and tighter integration between narrative and gameplay. One piece that's missing from this tool, though, is that the tool doesn't really have the context of what happens in the session, in the game, when the player tries to go out and complete a certain quest, beyond what the writer has written down in the quest description based on what they expect to happen. But players don't always do what we would expect them to do. They have their own personal goals, and they might chase their own interest, and that can lead to emergent narratives happening in the games, and we want this to happen. And we have some of this information, but it's usually buried in raw logs or gameplay data, telemetry that's really unstructured, and it can be hard to read and interpret and find patterns out of without spending a lot of time and effort. And writers don't always have time for this. But there is a lot in here that can be inferred and would be useful for writers to know. That's where the second tool comes in. So the second tool pre-processes the raw logs and then calls a large language model to narrativize and interpret the data and summarize it narratively. So it tries to pick out meaningful events from the session or any emergent narratives that it can see. It also tries to make inferences about how the player's strategies and goals have evolved during the session. This is an example of the tool being used, again with mock data. So essentially, you enter something like a player ID or a session ID, and then the tool gets the relevant logs and telemetry, and then interprets it and summarizes it to generate a few different types of summaries. It's sped up a little, but essentially, it produces summaries that are narrative and readable. These are screenshots of the different types of summaries. So this is an overview of what happened in the session. So this is just a narrative description of different events that have happened. This summary is more focused on combat scenarios that have happened in the session. So it generates a narrative description, as well as it tries to pick out some information, like what strategies did the player use during combat. This is a summary that's focused on social interactions that have happened during the session. And this is a summary that's focused on different locations that were covered in the session. You can also write custom prompts if you want custom summaries, or ask it some specific question that you'd like the answer to, and the tool will try to interpret the logs and answer that question. And this is really useful for writers and researchers to ideate on LLM-driven features that could potentially be introduced in the game. For example, maybe we want to see if we can add player-specific journals, or we want an NPC to talk differently based on what the player has done in the session. And this is a good place to experiment with stuff like that. So in the demo that I showed, we were querying for logs by session ID or player ID, but we can also think about querying for logs by players who have a certain quest active. So if we combine this with the quest chain evaluator that I showed earlier, we can get a fuller evaluation of the quest chain with context of what happens in session being added through the log explorer. But of course, to do this, we would need to already have some playtest data or telemetry data. We can't evaluate a fully new quest in this way. So what's also interesting to explore is just querying for any relevant past logs. So maybe you have a new quest that you're working on. You could query for past play sessions that have a certain location covered, that the location that we're interested in for the new quest. Or maybe there's a past quest that's similar to the new one that you're working on. You can query for logs that have that quest active. And then these logs can be interpreted and summarized and used as context for a language model to predict how the player might go about completing the new quest that we're writing. And when this is integrated with the quest chain evaluator, it gives us a fuller simulation of the quest chain. These are some of the challenges that we face with both the tools. So cost was initially a concern, especially for the quest chain evaluator, since we want to review many traversals and generate many reviews per traversal. But over the past year, the cost has decreased a lot, and now it's much more realistic and manageable. Language models are also prone to some common errors. They might hallucinate. They might make up events that have not happened in the logs, or they might make reasoning errors when they're interpreting the logs or evaluating the quest chain, and details can get lost inside long quest chains or long logs. These issues are getting better as well, but better and better language models, but they're still a risk. One of the other issues when it comes to using this practically is also that there could be missing context, and the tools can give some irrelevant results because of the missing context. So even when we use the logs to give context of what happens in the session, not everything is logged, so it doesn't have a full picture of the game. Both these tools have access to some parts of the game lore to use as context when it's going about doing their tasks, but not everything is written down there as well. There's a lot of internal team knowledge that might not be written down. And the lore also evolves very quickly. So sometimes the context, the background it has about the game might become outdated. So on the one hand, it can give some irrelevant results because of this. But on the other hand, we can use similar approaches like this to help track when lore gets outdated. So to conclude, both these tools are designed to help writers be more ambitious with the narrative spaces that they're making. It gives them the confidence to experiment with tighter narrative and gameplay integration. And the ultimate goal behind all this is that we want to enable the writers to write with the computational systems that exist inside the game rather than having to work around it. And yeah, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening. Not sure if I ran over time or not. Or
Time for 2 questions.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy for questions if anyone has any.
We have time for a handful of questions.
Oh, hey, thanks for the presentation. Are you fine-tuning your own language models?
So this is just a research prototype at this moment. So we've been prototyping with ChatGPT. But when we deploy it, we would consider using our own models maybe. But yeah, right now, this is all with ChatGPT.
Hi. So when the tool is traversing through the quest chain, how does it know and can it deal with things like subtext or sarcasm or things like, I don't know, like deliberate misdirection?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So earlier on, for sure, models weren't good at identifying these things, but they've come a long way since then. So with GPT-4o, for example, it is quite good at thinking about, oh yeah, maybe the writer said this to set this up ironically, or it is good at. So here, for example, if I go back. Where did I have the... Yeah, so here, as you can see, there's some chain of thought reasoning, and it also does some thinking in the opposite direction to think of maybe this is the reason the writer did this. So here under potential justification, you can sometimes see the model thinking about, oh yeah, maybe this is why, maybe the writer meant this sarcastically. So it is able to think in that way with the newer models. But of course, it might still be a blind spot. So this is like any feedback you'd get from players, I guess. You may decide that it's relevant, or you may look at it and decide that maybe it's not worth it. Maybe it's just missing some context or missing the intention that we had. It's just to surface that, and the writers can then verify if it's worth it or not. Yeah.
Okay. This will be the last question. Sorry.
How does the model deal with player emotions such as disappointment from not being able to complete a certain path due to their decisions?
So it's so the prompt that we use for this can be anything. So I don't know if you can see. So here, there's the demo that I showed is explore issues, which is just asked to raise anything that feels off that it can find. And then there's more targeted things like contradictions or continuity or confusion. So we can write prompts to pretend to get the language model to pretend to be a player and ask it, where did you feel the most frustrated? Like it's similar to the confusion thing, I guess. So it's using the common sense reasoning that's kind of like embedded in the language model to pretend to be a player, basically.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Right. Yeah.
That was
Thank
a lovely
you.
talk.